It's wonderful to be here tonight with FAAA. I've worked with so many of the museum's member groups over the years, and I know what a difference a healthy and thriving member group can make to this organization. So I welcome this reinvigorated FAAA under Gwen's leadership, and I know we all look forward to some exciting programs ahead. So thank you for having me. So tonight I will be talking about the Telfair's collection of work by African American artists. At last count, that consisted of 92 works of art, and both in the fine arts category and in the category of self-taught art or folk art. Tonight I will be speaking just about the fine art segment of the collection and not speaking about the folk art section. I invite you to consider inviting my colleague Harry DeLorme to speak at some point about the folk art collection, which he has stewarded over the course of, I guess, decades here at the museum and knows inside and out. So that would surely make a wonderful program that I know we would all enjoy. So I'll just delve right into the collection, which I'll present in roughly chronological order. We really don't have time, even though it doesn't sound like a lot of works, we don't have time to talk about every single object in this part of the collection. So I've picked out some of my real highlights, some of the real gems of the collection that we'll be looking at tonight. And please bear in mind that any one of these artists would merit a full, 2-hour lecture in and of themselves. And we don't have the time for that. So I'll pick out the highlights and hopefully leave you with a really interesting overview of some of the gems from our collection. So this first work is one that's actually on view right now over at the Telfair Academy. It's a painting by Henry Ossawa Tanner, an untitled marine landscape. Tanner is a really interesting artist. He was born in Pittsburgh. His father was a scholar and a minister of the African Methodist Episcopal Church there. But the family moved soon afterwards to Philadelphia, where Tanner had the opportunity to study at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts with Thomas Eakins, one of the leading American painters really of all time. So he enjoyed that opportunity and did very well with his studies, but he chose to go to Paris in 1891. And this was because he was really encountering a lot of difficulty here in the United States with the discrimination that he faced as an African American artist. And in his words, he said, he felt he could not fight prejudice and paint at the same time. So he wanted to go to a place where he would be more accepted and would not have this distraction, and ended up settling permanently in Paris and enjoyed a very successful career there. He studied at the Académie Julienne, and he focused mainly on religious paintings, different than the Telfair's work that we're looking at here. He was really quite successful. He sold important works to the French government, to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and did very well for himself with mainly with these religious paintings. But the Telfair's painting was created in 1880. The artist was just barely 20 years old. He had just turned 20 the year before. So this is a very early work in his career, and before he had limited his focus to mainly religious work. It's a really beautiful and luminous seascape, and it's really just, at the time the Telfair acquired it in 1998, it was only the 6th known marine scene by this artist to exist. And in fact, the White House acquired another marine work by Tanner in 1996, which was actually the first work by an African American artist acquired by the White House for its collection. And Tanner's recognition, of course, continues to the present day. He was recently honored with a solo exhibition at the Pennsylvania Academy, his alma mater, in 2012. So he continues to be recognized for his wonderful work. The Telfair also has another work, a nice drawing. It's a smaller work. Because it's a work on paper, it's really sensitive to light, so it's not something that we can frequently have out. But it's a really lovely drawing from a much later point in the artist's career. So by the time World War I rolled around, Tanner was still living in Paris and was enjoying being in France, but he had not forgotten about America, and he was too old to fight, but he did join the American Red Cross as a lieutenant of, what was his exact title? A lieutenant in the farm and garden section of the Red Cross. So he actually did really interesting work there. He innovated, and created and implemented a program that put convalescing soldiers to work farming the land. So they were creating food that was very much needed, and they were also keeping the soldiers' morale up as they were healing, keeping them busy and occupied with a worthy task. So while he was working with the Red Cross, he received permission from them to sketch some of their activities, and that is when he would have created this drawing during the later years of World War I. So another work from the collection that is currently out on view, this one is up in the third floor hallway here of the Jepson Center in a case along with several other works of sculpture from the early 20th century, is a work by Augustus Savage, which is noteworthy both for the artist who created it and for the subject that it portrays. Augustus Savage was associated with that really special and important period between the two world wars that's known as the Harlem Renaissance. And that period of time was the focus of an exhibition that we recently presented here at the Telfair that I hope you all saw, called Visual Blues. It was upstairs in our Levitt and Varnado galleries. So Savage was born outside of Jacksonville, and she spent much of her childhood in an area near West Palm Beach. But she was interested in sculpture from a really young age. Her town in Florida had clay pits, and she would get clay from the clay pits and sculpt little animals out of them. And this was not something really that her family embraced, but she persevered and ended up getting to New York to study at Cooper Union in 1921. And she did well for herself. She earned a Julius Rosenwald Fellowship to study in Paris for a year, and she really became part of the really exciting and dynamic artistic environment that was going on in New York at the time. She met and befriended W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, both of whom posed for portrait busts that she created. And she became the first African American to be elected to the National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors, so quite an honor. So she unfortunately could not afford to cast a lot of her work. It's a really labor-intensive process and quite expensive. So her work is very rare today, which makes us all the more grateful to have this work, which was donated to the Telfair by the Walter O. Evans Collection of African American Art back in the year 2003. Savage went on to also have an important role as a teacher in New York. She taught and influenced artists such as Norman Lewis, Jacob Lawrence, and Jacob Lawrence's wife, the subject of this portrait, and an important artist in her own right, Gwendolyn Knight. So Savage was an artist who, by moving from Florida up to the Northeast, became part of what we refer to as the Great Migration of so many African Americans who left the South to pursue greater opportunities and freedoms in the North. And we'll see that theme again and again with many of the artists that we look at today. Here we have a really wonderful drawing by Dox Thrash. Thrash was another of these artists born in the South. He was born in Griffin, Georgia, and ended up making his career in the North. He spent time kind of roaming the country, performing and figuring out his way, and ended up in Chicago around 1911 when he was still quite a young man. He took classes at the Art Institute of Chicago and paid his bills by working as an elevator operator, actually, in Chicago. He served 14 months with the U.S. Army during the First World War, where he was unfortunately wounded and was gassed and wounded. But he was able to return to the United States and ultimately resume his education in Chicago and completed his studies there. He spent more time moving around before settling in Philadelphia, which is the subject of the drawing in the Telfair's collection. And he's best known for his prints, and he was really considered a master of printmaking. And this work, like it's a drawing, but like prints, it has a really strong, like an excellent print, it has a really strong graphic quality. He has great use of the contrast of light and dark areas, as well as a wonderful, bold composition that really, it hinges on that strong diagonal created right in the center of the composition with that sharp uphill turns. Just a really wonderful, dynamic drawing. Thrash was really interested and committed to portraying scenes of everyday life, particularly everyday lives of African Americans. And that aesthetic aligns him with the painters of the American scene, who felt that a worthy subject for a work of art could be just an everyday occurrence. It didn't have to be some lofty mythological scene. And now we come to Jacob Lawrence. This actually is the first work by any African-American artist to have entered the museum's collection. It was part of a portfolio that was commissioned to celebrate the bicentennial in '76, but it was acquired in '77. So Lawrence is a major figure of the Harlem Renaissance and one of the most important African-American artists of all time. He was greatly influenced by his studies with Charles Alston and Augustus Savage, who we looked at just a moment ago. And he's best known for addressing issues of African-American history and questions of justice and human dignity through his series of narrative paintings. He is really one of the first African-American artists to have gained very widespread acceptance among the old guard of the art world, and really made great inroads. And one of his most important series is his Migration series, which consisted of 60 paintings telling the story of African Americans who left the South in search of greater equality and opportunity in the North. He was just about 23 years old when he undertook this. It was a very ambitious undertaking, and one that was really highly acclaimed. And the print that we see here, this is a serograph or silkscreen from the museum's collection that relates to that Migration series. So it's another work that explores that subject of migrants leaving the South. And here he shows folks casting their ballots once they've arrived in the North, something that would have been very difficult to impossible to have done in the South given the conditions at that time. So Lawrence was born in New Jersey himself, but his parents had taken part of the Great Migration, had come up from Virginia and South Carolina, so it was a subject that was very close to him. And this particular work shows his characteristic style, which consists of a very flat forms, very simple areas of color, kind of restrained, and really keeping the focus on the narrative. Narrative is a really important quality of his work. And another artist who was really closely affiliated with the Harlem Renaissance movement, and another of the really most important African-American artists of all time is Rohmer Bearden, who's represented in our collection with two really nice works. So Bearden was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, but he moved to New York when he was just a young child. His mother was a newspaper editor and a really prominent citizen, a prominent political and social figure in New York, and she ran with a really interesting crowd. It was not uncommon for him to see folks like Langston Hughes or Duke Ellington coming by the family home. So Bearden grew up in a really interesting artistic environment. After he earned a degree in mathematics from New York University, he really couldn't fight the art bug, and he enrolled in art classes at the Art Students League with the German artist George Gross. So from 1942 to 45, Bearden served in the U.S. Army and traveled to Paris. In 1950, he was able to go back to Paris and study art and art history and philosophy at the Sorbonne. He's really best known for his collage work. Now, neither of these works are collages, but it's interesting that even in his works that are lithographs, like the works that we see here, he still uses that style of collage, of different textures and different surfaces pieced together. But his collages are known for taking papers with different patterns and textures and creating his images through those. And throughout his career, he explored religious and mythological themes, incorporating these religious themes into genre scenes of everyday African-American life, really emphasizing the beauty and complexity of Black modern life. And we can see that here in the work on the right that takes on the subject of Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist. And although he only lived in North Carolina for a brief period of time, he returned quite often to see his family there. And the South and the spirit of the South was a really a driving force in much of his work. And we see that in the work on the left, Falling Star, which depicts, it's one of many works by him to depict sort of an everyday moment of life for an African-American woman in the South and in his trademark collage style. So here we have Sam Gilliam, who was actually the subject of one of the very first solo exhibitions here at the Jepson Center. I believe it was the third round of exhibitions. It was the fall of 2006, and it still remains one of my favorite installations in this building of all time, and I think you'll see why in a minute. But Gilliam is affiliated with the Washington Color School, which is not a formal school per se, but more of a loose association of artists who are interested in similar themes. They worked in the 1960s, and they were reacting to abstract expressionism and to folks like Jackson Pollock, who were really interested in gesture in painting. And they instead shifted that focus to the use of color and form in painting. So they were really reacting to a widespread popular movement. Gilliam was the only African-American artist to be loosely affiliated with this school of painting. And he was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, and he spent his youth in Louisville, Kentucky, He earned his bachelor's from the University of Louisville, then went on to spend 2 years in the Army, and then returned and earned his master's at Louisville as well. He moved to Washington, D.C. in 1962, which is where he came across the work of some of the color school artists like Morris Louis and Kenneth Noland and several others. And you can see that he adapted their aesthetic and made it his own by taking raw, unprimed canvas and staining, using acrylic paints to stain the untreated, unprimed canvases. And this work that in our collection is a really wonderful example of that. He was often doing a lot of painting with water, diluting his paint, getting it to the desired consistency. And he was also really interested in blurring the boundaries between what is considered a painting and what is considered a work of sculpture. So in this particular work, he has taken the traditional wooden stretcher bars that support a painting, and he's replaced them with beveled stretcher bars. And you can kind of just see that in the image around the edges there. So the painting has beveled edges. It kind of emerges from the wall, and it's about 3 or 4 inches deep off the wall. So it's definitely enough to give it sort of a sculptural presence in a really interesting way. The work that Gilliam is best known for is work that goes even 1 step or 2 steps beyond this, which is removing the stretcher bars altogether and taking these raw, unprimed canvases that have been stained with acrylic paint and then just draping them to create not just a sculpture, but really an entire artistic environment. And I wanted to just throw in one little installation shot. This was the Jepson Center exhibit that he had, and you can see one of these. If you've been upstairs in these galleries ever, you understand that this is a massive space, and this corner that is filled with this stained, draped piece is really just enormous. The impact of these works in person is really quite monumental and noteworthy. And here are 2 other works by Sam Gilliam that are also in our collection. We're really lucky to be able to represent 3 very unique aspects of this really important artist's career within our holdings. These 2 works, I think, really make the point that although Gilliam achieved a great deal of success with his early stain paintings and his draped works in the 1960s, he's not content to just keep creating with the same formula, despite what the market might demand or despite what critics were telling him. So he continued to sort of push the limits and work in a variety of different modes, seen in the Telfair's 2 works here. The work on the left is from a series called Chasers, and it shows that he's really interested in continuing to blur those boundaries between painting and sculpture. In this case, he is layering together and collaging together different asymmetrical pieces of canvas and then covering the whole surface of this irregular canvas with a very thick layer of paint that gives it a really sculptural quality. And he takes that even to another level with the work on the right, one of his wood constructions, which is created by different layers of wood that he's painted and cut to certain shapes that are then mounted. That piece comes about 8 inches off the wall, and the holes in it sort of create, they bring light and shadow into play. Light and shadow become part of the piece, and you can actually look through in parts. You see the shadows that they cast on the pieces behind them, and you even see, shadows and part of the wall behind it as well. So really interesting works. Another nice group of works in the collection is a series of 5 works from a portfolio that was published by Rolling Stone Press in Atlanta, and it was purchased by the museum in 1994. Now, this portfolio consisted of about 40 works altogether by artists either from Georgia or that had some tie to Georgia. And 5 of these artists happened to have been African American. So they are Beverly Buchanan, who we see here, but it also included work by Trina Banks, Michael Edward Ellison, Stephanie Jackson, and Mildred Thompson. And since we didn't have time to look at all of them today, I've just included the Buchanan as a representative work. Rolling Stone Press was founded in Atlanta in 1984 and really served as a wonderful resource to bring nationally and internationally acclaimed artists to the city and print really world-class editions of prints for them. So this work here is by Beverly Buchanan, who is best known for her depictions of Southern vernacular architecture. She was born in North Carolina and spent her childhood in Orangeburg, South Carolina, where her father was the dean of the School of Agriculture at South Carolina State College. And for her father's work, she would sometimes travel around with him and visit different farmers around the state. So really that rural landscape of the South was deeply ingrained on her from her childhood. She was interested in art from a young age, but she first pursued a career in public health. She moved to to New York in the 1960s and went on to earn not one but two master's degrees from Columbia University before deciding to change her track and to focus on fine art. She found her way to the Art Students League, took classes from Norman Lewis, and really received a lot of early encouragement from him, and also got to know and receive encouragement from Rohmer Bearden. And they both encouraged her to pursue art more fully, and she did. She moved to Georgia in 1977 and has worked on her art full-time ever since then. She's received a great deal of recognition, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and a fellowship from the NEA. And the image we have here I love because it's a sharecropper's shack, which is something that she would have seen quite often in her travels around the countryside in her youth, but was very rapidly disappearing. And rather than portraying this building as a site of destitution or impoverished life, she chose to sort of reclaim it and look at it as a place of hope and of unfulfilled dreams that could someday be fulfilled of the inhabitants. And that sort of hope and happiness, well, it's why she titled it Happy Shack. And the happiness really kind of vibrates off the page here. She's really reclaiming this modest structure and putting her own spin on it. So we also have this great photograph by Carrie Mae Weems, who has been really one of the leaders in her field for decades now and is doing really fabulous work. Her work is very heavily based in photography, but she often combines photographs with text or ceramics or different media for really interesting results. But this particular piece is part of a series called her Kitchen Table series, which is a series for which she's very well known. And at first glance, it looks like it could just be a simple snapshot of the domestic scene of this couple, around a kitchen table. But in fact, this image and every one of the images in this series is very carefully staged by the artist. Every detail is very carefully laid out by her. And she is the main protagonist. She's the figure standing there in the background. And when they're viewed in sequence, they tell the story of her as sort of the African-American every woman, of her life, love, loss, hardship, motherhood, but it's all framed around the same kitchen table, anchored by that same kitchen table from that same perspective, but just with different figures and characters joining her and moving in and away. So really interesting work, but they also stand up very well as individual pieces on their own. They invite you to ask questions about what's going on. There's sort of an implied narrative in the scene, but without offering really any answers. But there's definitely a sense of psychological tension and this heightened awareness that the woman has of the man, and this feeling that he has his back to her. The dynamic is just so interesting. But Weems was born in Portland, Oregon, and studied both art and folklore, which is really something that grounds a lot of her work. And she was interested in an early time in her career with artists who were involved in politics, and is really interested in discussing issues of social relevance and social justice in her work. She was also recently the subject of a really major exhibition, a solo retrospective of her work, organized by the Frist in Nashville, that then traveled to the Guggenheim and the Cleveland Museum of Art. It was a really huge deal and a really wonderful tribute to a very talented artist who's been doing great work for decades. So here we have another work that this slide doesn't really do it justice, because in real life it's almost as big as you see it on the screen here. It's got a really amazing presence to it. And this is by Georgia artist Randall Bailey. Bailey was actually born in New Jersey but grew up here in Georgia and has made his career here. And this untitled work is part of a series of works that he created as he was anticipating the birth of his first child. So he has, for each of these works, there's a central vitrine, and you can see there's that sort of clear, what you're seeing in the middle there is covered by like a clear layer of plexiglass, and then the image that you see is underneath it. It's recessed by several inches. And what you're looking at is an African figurine, and you're looking down at it. It's really hard to get a sense of it. It's deliberately disorienting at first. But right in the middle is the figure's head, and then at the bottom you can see one knee, and then below that a foot. So if you look carefully, you can kind of see it, and then you've got the hands, kind of the figure's in a seated position there. But He layers all sorts of interesting images and found objects that have social significance, and references everything from African sculpture to butterflies to music. He's also very interested in music, and that informs his work as well, particularly jazz music. And you can interpret his works as sort of visual riffs, really, that are kind of covering the surface of the work. The markings that he makes are layered. They have sort of organic elements to them, but at the same time, there's a rigidity to the forms and hard edges to many of the forms that really contrast very sharply with that. So here's another work that is on view at the moment, and many of you might have noticed it. You had to walk right by it to come in here. It's right on the landing on the second floor. And this is a sculpture by Richard Hunt, who's really one of the most important sculptors living today, and the first African-American sculptor to have had a one-person retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He grew up on the south side of Chicago and began his studies at the Art Institute of Chicago as a teenager. And by the time he was just about 20 years old, he had moved to his trademark style of working with welded metal for his sculptures. And he had mastered this technique, which is, very physical, very labor intensive, when he was still quite a young man. His works range in size from the more modestly scaled Telfair work, which is about 5 feet high, to works that are truly monumental in scale. And they're known for being abstract, but for referencing organic forms, like referencing the human body or animal figures or some sort of organic plant forms at the same time, while remaining very abstract as well. So because he's good at using these abstract forms to suggest themes, that work has led to a number of public art projects that are abstract but do reference themes, as I mentioned, like the Freedmen's Column at Howard University and Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Memphis, Tennessee. Another wonderful work that is always on view is the Glass House by Thurman Statham. And this is a work that was commissioned particularly for the Telfair's Jepson Center and for our Artseum, the children's interactive and educational area. And it resides on the 3rd floor of this building in the Artseum, and there it lives. But Statham is a really important glass artist. He grew up in Florida born in Florida, grew up in Washington, D.C., and studied at the Rhode Island School of Design. He was interested in working in all different sorts of media, but after experiencing a glass blowing session with Dale Chihuly, he was really intrigued by glass and chose to make his career in that area. So he was an early proponent of the studio glass movement here in the United States. He studied at the famed Pilchuck Glass Studio during its very first year of operation, which for glass artists is a big thing. And he's known for works like these that are composed of in large scale. He's got glass plates that are glued and fashioned together. But beyond the structure of this glass house, he also includes glass in many different ways within the house. From that vase, the blue vase that you see at the top, to there are some etched glass panels within the work. There's twisted glass, pulled glass, even shards of broken glass in one area of it. So he's really interested in looking at glass in a variety of different ways. He also incorporates found images and found objects into his work. And in the Telfair's piece specifically, there are different images and things that refer to the museum's history and permanent collection, and more broadly to Savannah's history as well. So, it's a work that was created to be enjoyed by children, and it's immersive. You can walk right through it, but I think it warrants a great deal of study and attention, and it's a really rewarding piece to spend some time with. So I encourage you to go spend some time up there if you haven't done so. And then this brings us to the most recent acquisition of a work by an African-American artist in the permanent collection. It's My Precarious Life by Whitfield Laval. And this work came here to the Jepson Center as part of a major retrospective exhibition devoted to the work of Whitfield Laval that we presented last year. And we were thrilled to be able to purchase it and add it to the permanent collection. And it's currently on view at the Cummer Museum in Jacksonville because that exhibition traveled there. So Laval is based based in New York, but he has family ties to the South, and he's interested in sort of the African American experience in general, and also specifically issues of identity, freedom, and history, and really a really broad and universal sense. But the work that he's really best known for is the work that we see here in front of us. This is a great example of the work that he's best known for, and that's work that creates a conversation between a portrait and a found object. And these portraits are these just beautifully rendered, detailed drawings done in Conti crayon, and the softness and the delicacy of the drawings really contrasts with his chosen support for the drawings, which is found wood. And some of the wood has nails sticking out of it, it has splinters and really irregular surfaces. So, the found wood, he likes the history that it has and the character that it has, but it's a really interesting contrast with the beautiful, refined surfaces of the drawings. And these drawings are created. They're very specific people. These are not just, generic man in a hat. This is a specific individual. And he takes these images from found photographs that he discovers when he scours antique shops and old bookstores and collects them really wherever he goes. He's just collecting things. And this particular work, even though he doesn't know who this man is, he kind of thinks of it as a bit of a self-portrait. And in this work, he gives us a little bit more than he usually gives, in that he's titled it My Precarious Life. So it kind of leads you to think, all right, he's making a statement about the precariousness of this man's life balanced on a wheel. It's about to turn over. More often, he will just pair an object with a portrait and then give you a title that kind of asks a question, but doesn't kind of lead you along as well as this. He's really more interested in posing questions and sparking dialogue without really giving you any answers. And if you come away from his work not understanding what he means, he's perfectly happy with that, as long as you've had an interaction with that and thought about it and engaged in conversation. And he's had a tremendously successful career. He's a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant and has been recognized by museums and foundations all over the world. So we were really thrilled we brought him here to Savannah to speak, and I hope many of you heard him. It was wonderful, and to have presented his work here, and now to have a piece for the permanent collection. So I was told that I should talk also about where we're going from here with our collection. This is just as I mentioned, a small sampling of the works by African American artists in our holdings. But you might look at this and say, well, I think there are about 4 of the works that we looked at tonight are currently out on view, and the rest are not on view. And a lot of them are works on paper, and that is the reason why, because works on paper are really susceptible to light damage, and they can't be out for more than a few months at a time. So what we're really looking to do is to add more works by African American artists that fit within the context of our collection and that we can have out on permanent view, or at least semi-permanent view. And that would kind of look differently in our different buildings. Here at the Jepson Center, you've probably noticed over the years, we do many changing exhibitions one after another, and we don't have any dedicated space for our modern and contemporary collection, whether that's by African American artists or others. And that's a problem that we have decided to rectify by devoting one of our major galleries to a semi-permanent installation of work from the permanent collection that will open next fall. And that show will include, for sure, several of the works that we looked at tonight, the Laval and the Gilliams, and the all of the major works will be included in there from the modern and contemporary side of things. But for the more traditional side of things, thinking about the Telfair Academy, if I'm dreaming the dream, which why not dream the dream? These are all works from the Smithsonian's collection, so these are not available on the market. But these are the types of things that would make sense for us. So within the context of this 19th century building, where we display a collection from the 19th and early 20th century, what we would love to do is to add in works, other works by Henry Ossawa Tanner, who's a really major artist and a really interesting figure, as well as other African American artists who were within that time period, and works would look amazing right in the Telfair Academy rotunda. I could see them fitting in there beautifully. As far as the Jepson Center goes, I mean, really the sky is the limit. When it comes to contemporary art, there are, I mean, pages and pages of amazing artists that I would love to add to the collection. But because I was just in New York and I saw this exhibition, I had to put this up here. Kahinda Wiley at the Brooklyn Museum. He does these amazing, we've been fortunate to present work by him before here at the Jepson Center, but this was several years ago, so many of you might have not seen it. He does these just gorgeously painted renderings of African-American males, and more recently he's been doing female subjects as well, posed in these poses that are reminiscent of old master paintings, and on an incredibly massive scale. They're just so powerful, but every surface of his work is just, I mean, it's just beautiful beyond description. And then he also does these really elaborate sort of Baroque backgrounds as well that compete for your attention and add to the drama and the impact of these works. So that is a summary of some of the favorite of mine African American works in the collection. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you for your attention.